The morning rain hammered against the windows of JFK Airport like tiny fists demanding attention. Inside Terminal 4, hundreds of travelers rushed past each other, their faces buried in phones, their minds already at their destinations. Among them walked a young woman who moved differently from the rest. She didn't rush, she didn't check her phone. She just walked with a slight limp that most people wouldn't notice, carrying a beaten canvas duffel bag that had more patches than original fabric. Her leather jacket, brown and cracked with age, hung loose on her thin frame. The name tag from the airline counter read simply M. Torres, though nobody would remember reading it. They would only remember what happened on Flight 447 from New York to Dallas, and how a woman sitting in seat 22C changed everything they thought they knew about judging strangers. Maria Torres had learned to become invisible years ago. It was easier that way. When you've seen what she had seen, done what she had done. The greatest gift was to walk through the world unnoticed. Her fingers traced the worn edges of her boarding pass as she waited in the boarding line. Group 5, the last group, the cheap seats. She didn't mind. After sleeping in desert bunkers and mountain outposts for the better part of 8 years, any seat on a plane heading home was luxury enough. The gate agent barely looked up when scanning her ticket. 22C, she mumbled. Middle seat. Board through the rear door. Maria nodded and walked down the jet bridge, her boots making soft thuds against the metal floor. Each step took her closer to Dallas, closer to a small apartment she hadn't seen in 14 months, closer to a life she barely remembered how to live. But first, she had to survive this flight, and something in her chest. That same instinct that had saved her life countless times in combat zones told her this journey would test her in ways that had nothing to do with altitude or turbulence. The smell hit her first when she entered the plane. That unique mixture of recycled air, cleaning chemicals, and too many people in too small a space. Rows of faces looked up as passengers struggled with overhead bins. Maria made her way to row 22, where a man in an expensive suit already occupied the aisle seat. He was maybe 45, with perfectly styled hair and a watch that probably cost more than Maria had made in her last year of service. In the window seat sat a teenage girl with earbuds in, her designer backpack taking up half the middle seat space. When Maria stopped at the row, the man looked up from his phone, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. His expression changed from mild annoyance to obvious disgust. He pulled his legs in dramatically, as if her presence might contaminate him. The teenager glanced over, wrinkled her nose at Maria's worn jacket, and turned back to the window. Maria said nothing. She simply lifted her duffel bag into the overhead bin, careful not to let anyone see how the movement sent sharp pain through her left shoulder, the one that had never healed quite right after Afghanistan. "Excuse me," Maria said softly, gesturing to the middle seat. The man in the suit, whose name tag from some conference read Bradley Morrison, Regional Sales Director, made a show of standing up, pressing himself against the seat in front, as if Maria might dirty his $1,000 suit. "Watch the shoes," he muttered, when Maria squeezed past. They were designer loafers, shiny and pointless. Maria's boots, scuffed and practical, had walked through places Bradley Morrison couldn't imagine in his worst nightmares. She sat down, making herself as small as possible, pulling her arms in tight. The teenager immediately shifted toward the window, creating as much distance as possible in the cramped space. Maria could hear her typing on her phone. Through the reflection in the window, she could see the message. "Oh my God," sitting next to some random, sketchy woman. "She smells weird. FML. Maria didn't smell weird. She smelled like cheap airport coffee and the rain from outside. But she said nothing, did nothing. Just closed her eyes and tried to remember the meditation techniques the VA therapist had taught her for moments like these. 10 minutes into taxiing, Bradley Morrison started his performance. He shifted dramatically. In his seat, sighing loudly each time Maria's elbow accidentally touched the armrest they were supposed to share. He called the flight attendant over, a young woman named Jennifer, with a practiced smile and tired eyes. "Excuse me," he said, his voice deliberately loud enough for surrounding rows to hear. "Is there any possibility of moving to a different seat? I'm extremely uncomfortable with my current arrangement." Jennifer's eyes flickered to Maria, then back to Bradley. "I'm sorry, sir, but this is a completely full flight. There are no other seats available." Bradley made a disgusted sound. "This is ridiculous. I pay for premium economy, and I have to sit next to ... double quotes." He paused, gesturing vaguely at Maria. "This?" The word hung in the air like a slap. Several passengers turned to look. Someone a few rows back laughed. The teenager next to Maria giggled and whispered something about coach class problems. Maria kept her eyes closed, her hands folded in her lap. She had been called worse things by better people. But inside, in a place she thought had been burned away by years of combat, something small and human hurt. Jennifer, the flight attendant, looked uncomfortable but professional. "Sir, I understand your concern, but every passenger has paid for their seat. I'm sure we can all be respectful of each other's space for the duration of the flight." She gave Maria an apologetic look before moving on. Bradley wasn't done. He turned to the passenger across the aisle, a middle-aged woman with an expensive haircut and matching jewelry. "Can you believe this?" he said loudly. "They'll let anyone on planes these days. Look at her. It's probably used her last welfare check for that ticket." The woman glanced at Maria, then back at Bradley, offering a sympathetic smile that said she agreed. More people were listening now. Maria could feel their eyes, their judgment, their assumptions. The teenager had taken out her phone and was recording, probably for some social media post about the crazy lady on her flight. Maria opened her eyes and looked straight ahead. On the seatback screen in front of her, the flight map showed they were still climbing, somewhere over Pennsylvania. 3 hours and 40 minutes to Dallas. She could endure anything for 3 hours and 40 minutes. She had endured much worse for much longer. The humiliation continued in waves. When the drink service came, Bradley made a show of covering his glass when the flight attendant reached across to serve Maria, as if poverty might be contagious. When Maria politely declined the $8 snack box because she wasn't hungry, not because she couldn't afford it, she heard him whisper to his aisle neighbor, probably waiting for handouts. The teenager posted another update. 3 hours. Next to homeless lady, someone save me. Maria saw it all, heard it all, felt it all. But she remained silent, still, dignified in a way that seemed to frustrate Bradley even more. He wanted a reaction. He wanted a scene that would justify his cruelty. Maria wouldn't give him that satisfaction. She had learned in places where weakness meant death that sometimes the greatest strength was in refusing to fight battles that didn't matter. But this battle, this small, petty war being waged in row 22, was starting to matter more than she wanted to admit. Each insult, each laugh, each cruel assumption chipped away at something inside her that she thought had been fortified beyond breaking. About an hour into the flight, somewhere over Indiana, Maria reached into her jacket pocket for the small notebook she always carried. It was leather-bound, worn soft with use, filled with words she wrote when the memories became too heavy. Bradley saw the movement and tensed, probably thinking she was reaching for food or something equally offensive to his sensibilities. When she pulled out the notebook and a pen, he relaxed slightly, though he made sure to lean far away as if her poverty might leak onto his expensive suit through the ink. Maria opened to a blank page and began to write, her handwriting small and neat despite the slight tremor in her hands that never quite went away after the explosion outside Kandahar. She wrote about the rain in New York, about going home, about the strange comfort of being surrounded by people who had no idea who she was or what she had done. She didn't write about Bradley Morrison or the teenager or the laughing passengers. They didn't deserve space in her notebook. They didn't deserve to be part of her story. The plane had been flying smooth and steady when everything changed. It started with a slight shudder, barely noticeable, like the aircraft had hit a pocket of unstable air. But Maria knew that feeling. Her body recognized it before her mind did. This wasn't turbulence. The engines changed their tune, a subtle shift in pitch that only someone who had spent countless hours in military aircraft would notice. She looked up from her notebook, her senses suddenly sharp, the fog of humiliation burning away in an instant of hyper-awareness. The plane wasn't climbing anymore. It wasn't descending either. It was holding, waiting. The captain's voice came over the intercom, and there was something in his tone, a mixture of confusion and barely controlled concern that made everyone stop what they were doing. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Williams. We've been instructed by air traffic control to maintain our current position and await further instructions. This is a standard procedure. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Standard procedure. Maria knew that phrase. It's what you said when you didn't want to cause panic. But there was nothing standard about a commercial flight being told to hold position in the middle of nowhere. Bradley Morrison immediately started complaining. This is ridiculous. I have a meeting in Dallas. It can't just stop us in midair. He pulled out his phone, trying to get signal at 35,000 feet, as if his importance could override physics. The teenager was excited, filming everything, probably hoping for drama she could post online. Other passengers started murmuring, that low rumble of anxiety that spreads through crowds when something isn't right. Maria remained still, but her mind was racing. She looked out the window past the teenager, scanning the sky with trained eyes. There, in the distance, approaching fast. Two dots that became shapes that became exactly what she thought they were. F-16 Fighting Falcons. Military escort. Her heart began to pound. Not with fear, but with recognition. Something was happening. Something big. The fighters pulled alongside the commercial plane, one on each side, close enough that Maria could see the pilots in their cockpits. The entire plane erupted in gasps and shouts. Passengers pressed against windows, phones came out despite flight. Mode and fear rippled through the cabin like electricity. "Oh my God, are we being hijacked?" Someone screamed. "It's terrorists," another voice called out. The panic was instant and consuming. Bradley Morrison had gone pale, his expensive suit suddenly worthless in the face of real danger. The teenager was crying, her phone shaking as she tried to film. Parents grabbed their children. Couples held hands. The flight attendants tried to maintain order, but Maria could see the fear in their eyes too. They didn't know what was happening, but something in the way the F-16s were flying, their position relative to the commercial aircraft, the smooth precision of their movements told Maria this wasn't a threat response. This was an escort, an honor guard. The captain's voice returned, and this time there was no hiding his emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. I've just received communication from United States Air Force Command. We are not in any danger. In fact, we are being given a military escort by direct order from Air Force One. Silence, complete, absolute silence. Even the babies stopped crying. Air Force One, the president's plane." Every single person on Flight 447 tried to process what they were hearing. Captain Williams continued, his voice thick with something that sounded like awe. "We have been informed that Air Force One has diverted from its scheduled flight path to personally escort our aircraft. This extraordinary measure has been taken to honor someone very special on board this flight. Someone whose service to our nation has earned the highest respect and recognition. The cabin exploded in whispers. Everyone looked around, trying to figure out who among them could possibly warrant such an honor. A diplomat, a general, some celebrity or politician. Bradley Morrison straightened his tie, probably thinking his regional sales director position had somehow attracted presidential attention. Others looked for uniforms, for signs of importance, for anything that would explain this unprecedented event. But Maria knew. In her jacket pocket, beneath the notebook, her fingers found the worn edge of a patch she had carried for 8 years. She didn't need to look at it. She knew every thread, every fray, every stain that wouldn't wash out. It bore her call sign, the name her squadron had given her after she had done the impossible, saved the unsavable, survived the UNSURVIVA. The cockpit door opened, and Captain Williams himself stepped out. He was in his 60s, gray-haired, with the bearing of someone who had probably served before taking to commercial aviation. His eyes swept the cabin, row by row, searching. When they reached row 22, they stopped. He walked down the aisle with purpose, passengers parting like water, everyone watching, everyone wondering. He stopped at Maria's row. Bradley Morrison looked up expectantly, already starting to rise, assuming he was the one being sought. But Captain Williams looked past him, directly at Maria. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying through the silent cabin. "Major Torres." Maria's hands stilled on the notebook. She looked up at the captain, and for the first time since boarding, she met someone's eyes directly. "Not anymore," she said quietly. "I'm just Maria now." The captain's eyes filled with something that looked like recognition, respect, and maybe even a little bit of awe. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you're never just anything." The entire cabin held its breath. Bradley Morrison's mouth had fallen open. The teenager had dropped her phone. Every eye was on the woman in the middle seat of row 22. The woman in the worn leather jacket with the tired eyes and the slight limp. The woman they had all dismissed, mocked, humiliated. Captain Williams continued, his voice now loud enough for everyone to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, the woman sitting in seat 22C is Major Maria Torres, United States Air Force, retired as of yesterday. Her call sign is Guardian Angel." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. 3 years ago, Major Torres flew an emergency medical evacuation mission in Afghanistan that saved the lives of 43 people, including a group of school children whose bus had been attacked. She flew through active fire, took multiple hits to her aircraft, and still managed to land and evacuate every single person. She was shot twice during the evacuation and still flew the damaged aircraft to safety. The cabin was so quiet, you could hear the engines humming. But that's not why Air Force One diverted today. The captain continued. 6 months ago, Major Torres volunteered for one last mission. It's a classified operation that I'm not at liberty to discuss. What I can tell you is that her actions directly saved the lives of several high-ranking officials, including someone very close to the president himself. Maria closed her eyes. She didn't want to see their faces change. She didn't want to watch shame replace mockery, didn't want to see respect born from authority rather than humanity. But she couldn't close her ears to the gasps, the murmurs, the sudden shift in the very air of the cabin. Captain Williams reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. "I've been instructed to read this message from Air Force One." He cleared his throat. "To Major Maria Torres, Guardian Angel. Your country owes you a debt that cannot be repaid. Your service, sacrifice, and heroism represent the very best of America. As you return home from your final mission, know that you do so with the gratitude of a nation and the personal thanks of your Commander-in-Chief. The fighters escorting this aircraft are from your old squadron. I requested the honor of bringing Their guardian angel home. Signed, President of the United States. The first person to start clapping was the teenager in seat 2. A tear streamed down her face as she brought her hands together. Then Jennifer, the flight attendant. Then the mother 3 rows back with her children. Soon, the entire cabin erupted in applause that seemed to shake the very frame of the aircraft. Bradley Morrison had shrunk into his seat, his face red with shame. His hands shook as he tried to form words. I didn't. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Maria finally opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked at him. She saw a small man in an expensive suit who had probably never faced anything more dangerous than a quarterly sales review. She saw someone who had built his entire identity on being better than others, on looking down from a height measured in dollars rather than character. And she felt something she didn't expect. Pity. It's okay, she said quietly, though her words carried in the still emotional cabin. You didn't know. Bradley's eyes filled with tears. Ty, but I should have treated you with respect, regardless. I should have been better. Maria nodded slightly. Yes, she said simply. You should have. The teenager beside her was sobbing openly now, her phone forgotten on the floor. The things I said, the posts I made. I'm so ashamed. You're a hero, and I called you. She couldn't finish. Maria reached over and gently squeezed the girl's hand. I've been called worse by enemy combatants. At least you didn't shoot at me. The girl laughed through her tears, a broken sound of relief and shame mixed together. For the next 2 hours, the plane flew in formation with the F-16S. Passengers took turns coming to row 22, shaking Maria's hand, thanking her for her service, apologizing for their assumptions and their silence when she was being humiliated. Parents brought their children to meet her. Veterans identified themselves, saluting her despite her protests that she was retired. Jennifer brought her a first-class meal, though Maria insisted she was fine with her middle seat and her empty stomach. She had learned to be fine with much less. The most moving moment came when an elderly man, walking with a cane, made his way from the back of the plane. He stopped at Maria's row, tears streaming down his weathered face. My grandson was on that school bus in Afghanistan, he said, his voice breaking. The one you saved. He's 10 now. He wants to be a pilot because of you. Maria stood then, protocol and humility forgotten, and embraced the old man while the entire cabin watched and wept as they began their descent into Dallas. The F-16s peeled away with a final wing waggle, a pilot's goodbye. The captain announced their departure, noting that Major Torres' squadron would be waiting on the ground to welcome her home. Bradley Morrison had spent the last hour in tortured silence, but as they prepared to land, he turned to Maria one more time. I need you to know something, he said, his voice raw. I'm going to remember this for the rest of my life. Every time I'm about to judge someone, dismiss someone, treat someone as less than, I'm going to remember the woman in seat 2 to see. You've changed me today. I know that doesn't undo what I did, but I wanted you to know. Maria looked at him, this broken man in his expensive suit, and saw something she recognized. The possibility of redemption. We all have the capacity to be better than our worst moments, she said. The question is whether we choose to learn from them. The teenager, whose name Maria had learned was Ashley, had deleted all her social media posts from the flight and replaced them with a single message. I sat next to a hero today and didn't recognize her because I was too busy judging her appearance. Her name is Major Maria Torres, and she saved lives while I was posting selfies. Be better than I was. See people for who they are, not what they wear. When the plane touched down in Dallas, something unprecedented happened. Instead of the usual chaos of people jumping up, grabbing bags, pushing toward the exits, Everyone remained seated. A flight attendant announced that Major Torres would be disembarking first. Maria tried to protest, but Captain Williams himself came to escort her. As she stood, pulling her worn duffel bag from the overhead bin, the entire plane rose to their feet. They stood in silent respect as she walked down the aisle, her slight limp more pronounced after sitting for so long. At the door of the plane, she turned back to look at the faces watching her. "Thank you," she said simply. "But I'm not the only one who serves. Every day, there are people among you, teachers, nurses, firefighters, social workers, volunteers, parents, who sacrifice for others without recognition. They sit in middle seats in coach class and bus stops, and they change the world without anyone knowing. Try to see them. Try to see everyone." As she walked up the jet bridge, she could hear the applause following her, but more importantly, she could hear the conversations starting. Passengers talking to each other, really talking, sharing stories, asking names, making connections. At the gate, a small group of Air Force personnel in dress uniforms stood at attention. Among them was Colonel James Washington, her squadron commander, the man who had given her the call sign Guardian Angel after her first rescue mission. He saluted sharply, and she returned it, though she was now a civilian. "Welcome home, Guardian," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The Air Force wanted to give you a proper send-off, but you disappeared before we could arrange it." Maria smiled, the first real smile she had worn in months. "I don't like goodbyes." "Well, too bad," the colonel said, grinning. "Because there are about 300 people from your various squadrons waiting outside to see you off properly. And the president sent something." He handed her an envelope. Inside was a handwritten note and a photo. The photo showed a group of children at a school in Afghanistan holding a banner that read, "Thank you, Guardian Angel." In both English and Dari, the note was simple. "They ask about you every day. They're all alive because of you. That's your real medal." A grateful nation. As Maria walked through the airport, still flanked by her military escort, she noticed something had changed. People weren't looking through her anymore. Word had spread, maybe through social media, maybe through the mysterious way important stories travel. Strangers nodded respectfully. A small child ran up and handed her a flower. An airline employee upgraded her connecting flight to first class, though Maria tried to decline. She had never needed first class. She had only ever needed purpose, and for 8 years, the Air Force had given her that. Now, as she prepared to return to civilian life, she wondered what purpose would fill that void. The answer came in a text. Message from Ashley, the teenager from seat 22A. "Major Torres, I know you don't know me, but you changed my life today. I'm starting a social media campaign called See Everyone, inspired by what you said. It's about looking past appearances and seeing people's real stories. Would you consider being our first interview?" Maria looked at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "I'm just Maria now. But yes, I'll tell my story if it helps others tell theirs." 3 months later, a video went viral. It showed security footage from Flight 447, the moment when Captain Williams announced who was sitting in seat 2 to see. The title of the video was simple. She was humiliated in 2 to see until her call sign made Air Force One divert to escort. The video had millions of views, but more importantly, it had started a movement. People began sharing stories of times they had misjudged others, times they had been misjudged, moments when they learned that everyone carries invisible battles and victories. Bradley Morrison became one of the most vocal advocates for the movement, using his position and resources to support veteran organizations. He kept a photo on his desk of row 22, a reminder of the day he learned that dignity isn't measured in dollars and that heroes don't always wear uniforms. Ashley, the teenager, started a nonprofit at her high school focused on bridging divides and seeing past surfaces. She kept in touch with Maria, who became a mentor and eventually a friend. The organization's motto was simple: everyone has a story. Take time to read it. Maria Torres returned to her small apartment in Dallas, to her quiet life, to her invisible existence. But she was no longer unseen. The local VA hospital, where she volunteered helping other veterans with PTSD, suddenly found itself flooded with donations and volunteers inspired by her story. The coffee shop where she sat every morning, writing in her notebook, became a gathering place for veterans and civilians alike, all drawn by the possibility of connection, of understanding, of seeing and being seen. She never wore her medals, never spoke of her missions unless specifically asked, never sought the spotlight that had briefly found her. But she did start writing more, filling notebook after notebook with observations about the beauty of ordinary moments, the courage of everyday people, the small acts of kindness that hold the world together. A publisher approached her about turning her writings into a book. She declined at first, then agreed on one condition: any profits would go to supporting Gold Star families and wounded veterans. The book, when it was published, was titled Middle Seat: Views from 2 to C. It began with these words: I have flown combat missions in war zones, saved lives under fire, and earned medals I keep in a drawer. But I learned more about courage, dignity, and grace while being humiliated in a middle seat on a commercial flight than I ever did in combat. This is the story of that flight, and of the truth I discovered at 35,000 feet. We are all fighting battles no one can see, carrying stories no one knows, harboring strength that goes unrecognized. The question isn't whether the person next to you is worthy of respect. The question is whether you have the wisdom to offer it regardless. The dedication was simple: to everyone who has ever felt invisible. You are seen. You matter. You are enough. The book became a bestseller, not because Maria was a war hero, but because she wrote about the war we all fight every day. The battle to see and be seen, to judge less and love more. To recognize that every person we meet might be someone's guardian angel, even if they're sitting in seat 2 to see years later. When Flight 447 had become a footnote in history, and Maria Torres had returned to the anonymity she preferred, Bradley Morrison would still tell the story to anyone who would listen. He would describe the woman in the worn leather jacket, the quiet dignity with which she bore humiliation, the grace with which she accepted recognition, and most importantly, the words she spoke about seeing everyone. He would always end the story the same way: I was successful, wealthy, important in my own mind, but I was small. She had nothing I could see, wore nothing impressive, claimed no status or position. But she was giant. She taught me that true strength whispers while insecurity shouts, that real heroes often hide in plain sight, and that the person you dismiss today might be the one history remembers tomorrow. His audience would nod, moved by the story, then return to their lives, hopefully a little more aware, a little more kind, a little more likely to see the guardian angel sitting beside them in the ordinary moments of extraordinary lives. Maria Torres died peacefully in her sleep 15 years after Flight 447, surrounded not by medals or military honors, but by letters. Thousands and thousands of letters from people who had read her book, heard her story, been changed by her example. Letters from teenagers who had stopped bullying. Letters from executives who had learned to value people over profits. From veterans who had found hope in her words. Letters from ordinary people who had discovered extraordinary courage in their everyday lives. Her funeral was attended by thousands, but according to her wishes, there was no military pomp, no 21 gun salute, no missing man formation. Instead, there was a simple reading of names. All the names of people she had saved, helped, inspired, or touched. The reading took 3 hours. At the end, Captain Williams, long retired but still sharp in his memory, stood and spoke the words. That had changed everything that day over Dallas. She wasn't just a passenger. She was a hero. But more than that, she was a teacher who taught us the most important lesson of all. Everyone deserves dignity. Everyone has a story, and everyone, absolutely everyone, deserves to be seen. The last speaker at her memorial was Ashley, now a successful advocate for social justice and veteran affairs. She stood at the podium, no longer the teenager who had mocked a stranger for her appearance, but a woman shaped by that moment of shame and redemption. Major Maria Torres, guardian angel, taught me something that day in seat 22A. She said, her voice carrying across the silent crowd. She taught me that we all have the power to lift others up or tear them down, to see or to overlook, to judge or to understand. Every day, we sit next to strangers on planes, trains, buses, and in waiting rooms. We stand behind them in lines, pass them on streets, work beside them in offices. And every single one of them is carrying something we cannot see. A victory, a loss, a fear, a dream, a story that would break our hearts or inspire our souls if only we knew. Maria's life was extraordinary, yes, but her message was beautifully simple. Look closer, judge less, love more, see everyone. As the crowd dispersed, many stopped at a simple plaque that had been installed at the entrance to the memorial garden. It read, "In memory of Major Maria Torres, who showed us that heroes often sit in middle seats, that strength sometimes wears worn leather, and that the greatest courage is in choosing kindness when the world gives you every reason not to." She was humiliated in 2 to see until her call sign made Air Force One divert to escort. But her greatest victory was in teaching us all to see. The call signs written on every heart, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be honored, waiting to be seen. And so the story of Flight 447 lived on. Not as a tale of military glory or presidential recognition, but as a reminder that every person we meet deserves the dignity we would want for ourselves. In airports around the world, in the years that followed, something changed. People looked up from their phones a little more often. They smiled at strangers, helped with bags, offered their seats, and someone different, disheveled, or disadvantaged sat beside them. They remembered Maria Torres and chose kindness over comfort, curiosity over judgment. The movement she never meant to start became her greatest mission. Accomplished not through combat or courage under fire, but through quiet. Dignity in the face of cruelty, grace in the moment of recognition, and wisdom in the words she left behind. Row 22, Seat C, in planes across the globe, became an unofficial symbol of possibility. A reminder that the person sitting there might just be a guardian angel in disguise, waiting not for recognition, but for the simple human kindness of being seen, acknowledged, and valued for who they are, rather than what they appear to be. The story ends where it began, with rain, with travelers rushing through terminals, with quick judgments and missed connections. But now, sometimes, just sometimes, someone remembers the woman in 2 to see, and chooses to see differently, to act differently, to be differently. And in those moments, Maria Torres lives on, not as a war hero or a viral sensation, but as what she always wanted to be: a quiet force for good in a world that desperately needs more guardian angels. Whether they're flying combat missions or simply sitting in middle seats, bearing witness to the truth that everyone, absolutely everyone, deserves to be seen with dignity, respect, and love.